She was 5 minutes late. He fired her in front of everybody, but he had no idea who had been watching. The rain had not let up all night. It blurred the neon of the highway exit like wet watercolor, turning taillights into drifting lanterns. Denise Carter's windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm. 1, 2, sweep. Her hands were tired from a double shift, from plates and orders, and smiling through the last hour when the booth by the window refused to close its tab on time. Her coat smelled faintly of coffee and fry oil. The heater hummed against the cold. She was supposed to be home, but the road was messy with drivers going too fast. She was a woman who always slowed down. At the shoulder, a car's hazard lights blinked, dim and frantic. Steam curled from its hood like a ghost. Denise slowed, pulled onto the gravel, and killed the engine. The storm made everything intimate in small, abrupt ways. Rain snapping on the roof, the soft slap of her jacket as she opened her door, the urgent human shape huddled beside a luxury sedan, one hand pressed against the metal as if steadying his breath. He was older than she guessed at first glance, not fragile, but small in the way that a person seems to fold inward. His suit was soaked at the shoulders, and his shoes had lost their shine to sleet. He held a cell phone useless against the weather. Denise stepped across the slick pavement and offered the single, simple thing she could: a ride. "Where can I bring you?" she asked, voice low against the rain. "Anywhere," he said, with the casualness of someone used to being tended to. He didn't strike her as entitled, just tired. He climbed into her truck with the slow care of someone who had learned to measure his steps. She drove them to a deli that stayed open late on the edge of the highway, the kind of place with a heater that argued against the cold, and a coffee urn that had its own ancient smell. She laid out a towel on the bench and a bowl of soup on the table, leaned forward to rub the man's fingers while he coiled warmth back into himself. He asked for nothing more than a cup of tea and a place to sit. When he closed his eyes for a while, she let him. She covered him with one of her sweaters because the world, outside, made ghosts of people in minutes. Before he left, he wrote a few words on an old receipt from the counter and slipped it into her hand like a folded coin. "Thank you for seeing me," it read. 3 simple lines that landed in her chest the way a bell might. Small, clear, impossible to ignore. She watched him drive away, the taillights swallowed by the rain, and held the paper until the ink blurred. Morning arrived with a silence that felt borrowed from another world. The diner smelled of bacon and old coffee, an honest smell that steadied her. Denise, a black waitress who worked long hours and kept her face open like a window for people who needed to look out, unlocked the back door and shook the water from her coat.
She was late by minutes, soaked to the collar from the steps between the truck and the deli in the storm, apologetic before she had even set her tray down. Steve Harlow saw the moment with a particular hunger. He had managed the place long enough to own its rhythm and to believe his voice had the authority of the schedule. He had a way of speaking that made people feel very small, like they were loose threads he could snip without thinking. Today his jaw was already tight. "Denise!" he barked, loud enough for the counter and both booths to hear. Plates stopped, conversations pulled inside their pockets. "You're late again. We don't run this place for your convenience." She met his eyes and kept her shoulders steady. "I'm sorry, Steve. There was a—" He didn't let her finish. He slapped an apron onto the counter between them, its fabric making the only sharp sound in the room. "You're done. Get out. Take your things." The humiliation was a slow, bright thing. People turned to look because public shaming requires an audience. A child in a corner booth watched with wide, honest eyes. One of the cooks murmured something. The dishwasher's hand stopped mid-motion. Denise folded the towel she had used the night before and slid it into a bag without a word. She stepped out into the drizzle and the cold and the steady, indifferent rain. It struck her face like tiny nails. She walked away without making the scene worse than it already was, because she had always chosen to protect others' days, even when her own was fraying. The door clicked shut behind her. For a long, small moment, she stood under the neon sign that sputtered at the street's edge, and wondered if the receipt with the blurred ink had been some kind of dream. If you like heartwarming, real-life stories, consider subscribing. She had not expected him to show up at all. The man from the night before, the one who had leaned on her shoulder for warmth, the one who had slept on her couch in that deli, walked into the diner the next morning carrying himself with the same quiet precision that had marked his movements when the rain had slowed them both down. He wore a different coat now, and when he glanced into the room, the chatter that had been trying to float back into place fell silent.
Not because he was loud, because something about him suggested that he belonged even where people were used to belonging. He moved toward the counter with the patience of a person who does not need to announce himself. Steve straightened as if he had arranged the air for such a visitor, and then noticed the man only in the way other people notice a light turned on across a room. The man looked at the staff, made a listless bow, and then fixed his gaze on Denise. "Denise?" he asked. She stood a little off balance, damp, apron-bagged, the image of someone who had been dismissed, beautifully reduced to a moment's shape. She did not recognize the man at first, beyond the hospitalities of the night.
He could have been any stranger, except that he wasn't. "I was in a bind last night," he said. "You helped me. You gave me dry clothes and soup and—" He paused, as if he were choosing his words for their weight. "You gave me your blanket." The room shifted like a breath drawn in. Steve's voice trimmed down to a new strain of politely surprised. He started to speak, to insist on procedure or some tiny rule that would preserve his pride, but the man raised a hand. When he spoke, his words balanced on something more important in the manager's authority. "Kindness tells me exactly what I need to know about a person," he said. "We can't run a place without people like that." He unfolded a card from his pocket and set it on the counter. The staff leaned forward as if the card might emit a light. Steve read the name like a verdict. Henry Weston. The man had a way of saying his name like a final chord, a sound that settled a room. "You should be here," Henry told Denise, looking directly at her the way a surveyor looks at land that could be planted. "Not outside, not shamed in front of customers. You're coming back, and I want you to help run this place." It was not a small thing to be named co-manager on the spot, not when the world had put a manager's voice into the air and meant for it to be heard. Denise's hand closed on the towel she had tucked into her bag as if it were a lifeline. The staff exhaled at the same time. People smiled in that cautious way woken by unexpected good news. Steve's face tightened. Pride is its own currency. Losing it makes some people poor. He muttered something about protocol and company policy, words that float and then vanish when someone with enough power decides the day's course. Henry listened only briefly before cutting across him, blunt like weather. "You're being unfair," he said. "She's here." She showed who she is. The reinstatement was immediate and quiet. Henry walked the diner with Denise, placing his hand on the counter, tasting the coffee, watching the way the booths sat like patient ships. He asked questions that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with people. His decisions were simple and kind in ways that felt rare. Denise did not shout or crow. She simply took the apron he offered and tied it around her waist as if tying a ribbon to a small mercy. The new rhythm took hold slowly. People came back because other people told them there was a woman at the helm who cared about the way they were seen. The diner began to feel like a place that had been washed, not in an instant but by steady hands that wiped surfaces and offered guests a consistent smile. Denise moved among tables with the ease of someone who knew how to make a bad morning less sharp. Steve, meanwhile, watched the changes as if he were a man standing at the edge of a parade that had forgotten him. His resentment simmered in the corners.
At first, it was small. A drawer left open, a discrepancy in the register chalked up to a sleepy evening. Denise noticed odd things but did not claim them as proof. There are people, she believed, who make mistakes. There are people who deserve correction. She had no desire to be a ledger wart on someone else's conscience. But the incidents multiplied. Small amounts of cash went missing from the till. The nightly receipts did not match the bank drop. Regular customers began to mention odd items missing from their checks, bills that had been altered by a few dollars here and there. The management's trust, once given, began to be tested, and tests like that have a way of turning neighbors into witnesses for one version of a story. Denise's face grew quieter through the stretch of those days. She knew enough of workplace injustice to recognize a pattern. Blame gets pinned to the people who are visible. She was visible. So was Steve's anger. But there are systems that do a better job of finding truth than rumors and assumptions. Henry noticed the unevenness and did not like it. He watched deposits, inventory, and the faces of people who worked the line. He believed in accountability, but also in the possibility of restoration, and he refused to let the diner slide into a small, mean kind of justice that punishes first and asks questions later. He asked Denise, privately, how she felt about putting measures in place: cameras in the offices, a check-in system for cash drops, a private investigator to review the recent openings. She agreed, not because she wanted to prove anything dramatic,
but because she wanted the diner to be a fair place where staff could work without the pull of suspicion. "I don't want to be the person who watches people," she said softly. "I just want the work to be honest." So they did it the way Henry liked things done, quietly, methodically. Cameras were set up where privacy wouldn't be violated, but where actions that had financial consequences could be observed. A discreet private investigator was hired, a person who sat at the margins and wrote down what the cameras could not show: patterns of behavior, late-night habits, small lies that look like little things until they aren't. What they found was neither spectacular nor cinematic. It was simply what happens when someone decides to protect his ego by swallowing other people's dignity. The footage showed a hand moving in a drawer after the lights were dimmed. It showed a manager's badge left on the counter while a shift closed. It showed, finally, a figure, unmistakable in movement, in the way his shoulders pitched when he reached, planting a set of receipts and stuffing a few bills into his jacket. The investigator's report led to the moment everyone had been waiting for, and no one wanted to watch it. Henry called a staff meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, when the rush had died and the sun slanted through the blinds, as if it were making room for truth.
The staff gathered around the counter like people at a wake, anxious for something to end and tired of not knowing. "We had some concerns," Henry began, voice even as stone, and then he pressed play. The footage rolled across a small screen projector, a jerky, unremarkable record of ordinary evenings. There was the clatter of pots, the murmur of conversation, the steady work of a place. And then there was the pocketing of cash, the folding of receipts, the way a uniformed manager left with his coat zipped and his chin up. The room breathed out as if it had been holding its breath too long. Steve stood as if he could make his body into a denial. His face did things in quick succession: color draining, pride snapping, a red that had nowhere to go. The police, who had been called quietly after Henry and the investigator had reviewed the footage, were waiting at the back door with a calm that made the air feel safer. They spoke with the practiced patience of people whose work is to hold a police steady while truth rearranges it. There was no melodrama in the arrest. Steve walked handcuffed past a dozen eyes that had known him only as someone who loved his authority too much. There was no cheering beyond the small human sound of relief, breath released, shoulders less heavy. No one celebrated humiliation. They had wanted fairness, and now they had it. Denise stayed about as reserved as ever. When people reached out with hands or free offers, she declined to gloat. She understood what it was to be shrunk in front of others, and a part of her knew how that felt in a way that made triumph taste thin. Henry watched her with something like respect and something like gratitude. He had seen what she had done the night before and what she had endured since. He had not come to the diner to save a business. He had come because he believed places change when the right people are chosen to steward them. The diner changed its name a few weeks later, Rainy Day Diner. It was Henry's idea, and a gentle one, meant to honor the morning that had revealed a character and restored a dignity. The new sign was a small, tasteful thing, with a hand-painted script. People in the neighborhood said the name sounded like hope, a place where storms were expected, and more importantly, prepared for. Business slowly improved. Regulars returned with stories about the tape being played at the meeting, and the way the manager had walked out like a scene from a closed stage. Local attention followed in small waves. Mavers posted about the reopening, and how the coffee tasted like work that respected the people making it. Henry invested in new booths, a deeper espresso machine, and a small tabletop sign that reminded customers the diner was a community space. There were practical changes too. Cash handling procedures were tightened, training was offered for staff who wanted to learn bookkeeping basics, and shifts were written with clearer coverage so that no one would be blamed for something they hadn't done. Denise learned to manage not by ruling with an iron voice like Steve, but by listening and by making room for people to do better. Her leadership was patient and exacting in its own way. She insisted on kindness, but she also insisted on accountability. As the months moved through the sailor's calendar of the small business, Henry and Denise met over coffee in the diner before doors opened. They discussed schedules, menus, and the slow art of rebuilding trust. Henry listened more than he spoke, and when he did, it was with a light that suggested he had been watching people his whole life, learning how to live with them rather than above them. Eventually, he asked Denise if she wanted more than the title of co-manager. The word partner can feel heavier than it looks on paper. It opens a door beyond change. It secures a place within a plan. He offered her a stake in the business in a conversation that had no ceremony beyond the clattering of dishes and the hum of early customers.
"I don't want anyone to think this is a gift," he said, folding his hands over his coffee. "This is an investment. You've earned it." She looked at him for a long minute, then at the people moving quietly in the dining room. A woman with a newspaper in the corner, a man who always asked for extra mustard, a teenager on his first job learning to carry plates. She thought of the night he had been stranded, how he had let her see him small and not call it weakness. She thought of the morning she had been forced out into the rain. Things in her chest rearranged the way old books reshelved themselves after someone had gone through and made sense of them. "Thank you," she said finally. "But I want to make something clear. I don't want this to be about me getting even. I want it to be about making this place steady." Henry smiled the kind of smile that made him look younger. "That's exactly why I want you in," he said. Not everyone moved on as gracefully as Denise demanded. Steve received a small charity donation weeks later, a check that would not erase what had been done, but might buy him a way to stand instead of stumble. Denise wrote an envelope and tucked inside a note. She did not use it to lecture. She used it to offer a bridge. "Everyone deserves a second chance," the note read. "I had mine." She handed it to him in a moment that took courage. It was not to absolve him of the harm he caused, but to remind him, quietly, that his next move still mattered. She had known humiliation. She had chosen not to become a shaper of humiliation herself. There is an uncommon bravery in being kind to someone who has treated you badly. It does not erase the past, but it does nudge the future.
The diner itself became a place people recommended without apology. People came during storms and left saying how they had been made warm. The sign outside glowed on rainy nights like a promise. Henry oversaw the diner's small reinvention with a steady hand, and Denise ran the floor the way someone runs a home, with adjustments made for comfort and a watchful eye so no corner grew cold. A local reporter stopped by, like reporters do, and asked questions about the surveillance, the arrest, the change in ownership. Denise answered without flourish. "We did what we had to do," she said. "We protected each other." In quieter moments, she would stand at the counter as the rain worked itself against the windows, watching steam rise from cups like small storms captured inside glass. She would tidy a napkin dispenser or count steps between booths. She would remember the night the stranger had leaned on her for warmth and felt grateful for the trivial dignity of that receipt in her pocket. She kept the folded scrap of paper in a drawer behind the counter, next to a box of extra pens. People who came in during bad weather often told the story like a kind of comfort, that someone once had slowed down for another person, and that the world had bent for a little while to favor kindness. Children were taught a sort of civic prayer at the diner, not a doctrinal thing, but a simple scriptability: we help when we can. Parents smiled. The staff followed, because the policies encouraged it, but because they had learned that being seen made the work matter. Denise never sought a spotlight. She was wary of being made an emblem. Her days were full of small duties, smoothing creased menus, remembering the regulars' orders, offering an extra napkin without asking. Yet locals started to notice the pattern: a woman who kept a calm face when things were at their worst, who leaned toward people instead of away. Henry and Denise decided to host weekly Friday nights, when the diner would stay open late and offer free meals to anyone who came in unexpectedly, an idea born from how Denise had been the unexpected shelter on a stormy night. It became a small tradition that filled the diner with people who needed a place and who, in return, offered conversation and laughter. The idea was simple. A restaurant doesn't only feed bodies, it feeds the sense of belonging. One rainy evening, months after the first night, a familiar luxury sedan pulled up outside. Denise saw it through the window, its silhouette reflected in the glass. The older man stepped out once more, but this time he was not stranded. He walked inside with the easy confidence of a person who knows his place and his power. "Henry," she said, because that is what she now called him in private, and he blinked like a person who had always been there. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee black, and watched as Denise moved through the service like someone who had learned to steward both the cups and the people. "How's the place?" he asked. "It's good," she said. "Busy, warm." He looked at her, searching for something. "You did more than take my blanket that night," he said quietly. "You made me see what was possible. I'm glad I found you." She smiled. Not a big smile, not one for public consumption. A small, true one. He had saved her job and helped remold the diner into a kinder engine. She had done the small thing that made him choose to invest in a different kind of leadership. It was a trade in humanity rather than money. The rainy day diner lived through more storms, literal and metaphorical. But each night, people came in who felt like they could belong.
Denise's name appeared on a paper contract that spelled out her stake. She signed it with a hand that had learned how to steady itself through trembling nights. There was an awkward satisfaction in formalizing something that had always been a matter of character. Henry made it official not to be magnanimous, but because he believed in the structural power of partnership. When someone is given responsibility and authority, the whole place changes. Sometimes, when the world felt too loud, Denise would take the folded receipt from her drawer and read the 3 words again. "Thank you for seeing me." It was a small liturgy that reminded her that quiet, ordinary acts can ripple into the lives of others. She had not performed heroics, she had simply stopped to help. That pause had changed the course of more than one life. At the end of the season, the diner threw a modest reopening party. There were paper lanterns, a new chalkboard menu with the day's special scribbled by hand, and a playlist that sounded like afternoons at the park. Neighbors brought pies, children chased each other near the booths. Henry gave a short, unshowy speech about community and investment, and Denise thanked the staff for sticking together. She did not speak at length because she believed the work spoke for her. Plates kept moving, orders were accurate, laughter threaded the room. Steve did not attend. He had his own path to walk, and the police had done what they were allowed to do. Denise left a final note on the old manager's office desk, a plain envelope with a check inside intended for a charity the diner supported. The envelope bore her handwriting and nothing else. The note was quiet. It wasn't a justification. It was an offer. Start over. "Everyone deserves a second chance," it said. I had mine. That line became, inexplicably, a quiet legend in the neighborhood. People repeated it not as a boast, but as a practice. It was recited by servers in the mornings when the weather was bad, by someone who needed courage to knock on a stranger's car window and offer help. It was said by the woman who finally decided to apply for a job after years of standing by, watching others move. It was a phrase that reminded everyone, inside and outside the diner, that lives are altered by small mercies.
When the storm clouds gathered months later, they seemed less like threats and more like the reason the rainy day diner existed. Denise would glance at the window and remember the night a man had trusted her enough to sleep in the corner of a deli on her blanket. She would check the list of specials and make sure the heaters were filled with more than heat, with promise. The diner's story was not about vengeance or spectacular fortune. It was about a woman who chose to stop and help, a man who paid attention to that choice, and a community that learned to hold itself accountable. It was about the way small acts of compassion can be the hinge on which a whole life swings. Denise's second chance at work was not simply a title or a pay increase. It was a restoration of dignity, an opportunity to lead in ways that healed rather than harmed. On quiet mornings, when the city was still half asleep, Denise would stand near the door and watch the rain. She would think of the receipt with the ink smudged as if from tears. She'd tuck it back into her drawer and put on an apron. She tied it the same way she had the first day Henry named her co-manager, with care, with the sort of attention that keeps things from coming undone. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small kindnesses matter.